At the age of 77, Raymond Reid Foster, a former high-ranking government official, had long learned that staying active was the secret to a long and healthy life. Living in the peaceful, picturesque town of Maplebrook, Ray made it a daily routine to walk through the streets of his neighborhood, a place where everyone knew each other's names and trouble was something that only seemed to happen on TV. However, on this particular morning, he was about to witness something that would turn his calm routine upside down. Ray had just passed the small, quaint cafe near the edge of town when he heard a sudden shout. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the noise. In a narrow side street, he saw an elderly woman struggling with two young men. One of them was yanking at her handbag, while the other was attempting to take a necklace from her neck. Without thinking, Ray shouted, "Leave her alone." The two men froze, looking up at Ray. For a split second, they hesitated, glancing at each other, but as Ray stepped forward with a look of determination, they turned and ran, disappearing down the alley without a word. Ray stood for a moment, watching them flee. Pathetic, he muttered under his breath, but he didn't chase them. He was no longer in the prime of his youth, and he knew better than to risk chasing after thieves. Instead, he turned to the woman, who was still clutching her empty bag with trembling hands. "Are you okay?" Ray asked, his voice soft but steady. "I'm fine, I think," she managed to say, tears welling up in her eyes. "They took everything." Ray gave her a gentle nod and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, I'm sure help is on the way." Just as he said that, a police car skidded to a halt at the end of the alley. The officer inside jumped out quickly, his boots hitting the pavement with a sharp sound. Ray recognized him instantly. It was Officer Ben Cole, a young, eager cop who had been on the force for less than a year. Without acknowledging Ray, Officer Cole rushed toward the woman. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softening as he knelt beside her. Ray stepped back, letting the officer do his work. But as he moved away, Cole's attention shifted. The young officer's eyes narrowed as he spotted Ray standing nearby. "Stay away from her," Ben snapped, his hand going to his holster. Ray froze, surprised by the harshness in his voice. "Excuse me? I was just helping." "I said stay away." Ben interrupted, now stepping toward him with his hands still on his gun. "Step back now." The elderly woman looked up in confusion. "Officer, you don't understand." He was the one who scared them off. But Ben wasn't listening. "Not now, man. I've got this." He glared at Ray with suspicion. Ray held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Listen, officer, there's been a mistake. I was helping her." But Ben's mind was already made up. "I don't want to hear your excuses." "Hands where I can see them," he demanded. Ray complied, his patience beginning to wear thin. This was clearly no longer about the robbery. Ben's posture was tense, and the situation was escalating far too quickly. The woman, now visibly upset, tried again to explain. "Please, officer. He's the one who helped me. Those boys ran off as soon as he stepped in." But Ben ignored her plea. His eyes were now focused entirely on Ray. "What's your story, old man? Trying to run after your little crime?" Ray's frown deepened, his patience finally slipping away. "I've already told you. I was trying to help. I scared those punks off. I did what you're supposed to do, not just sit around." Ben's voice became hostile. "You think I'm a fool? Save it for the judge." Ray exhaled deeply, trying to remain calm. "You're making a big mistake, officer." Ben's fingers twitched near his gun, and Ray knew things could get worse if he wasn't careful. He began to slowly reach into his jacket pocket. "Don't move," Ben shouted, his hand now on his weapon. Ray froze, his hand still hovering. "I'm just getting my ID." The officer's eyes flickered nervously, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't pull anything, old man." Ray slowly withdrew his wallet, opened it, and held up a badge for Ben to see. The officer's eyes widened as he saw the emblem. "Look at it, officer," Ray said, his voice firm. Ben blinked, still stunned. The crowd that had gathered now murmured amongst themselves, their phones raised, capturing the intense scene. Ray's voice cut through the tension. "I'm Raymond Foster, former Assistant Attorney General. Ben's face drained of color as the realization hit him. He stared at Ray for a long moment, then lowered his gun, visibly shaken. "Sir, I didn't know," Ben stammered, his voice cracking. Ray gave him a cold, level stare. "No, you didn't know because you didn't bother to ask before jumping to conclusions." His tone was steady but carried the weight of years of experience. "This was reckless, officer. You had no reason to assume I was involved in anything." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, some calling out comments about the officer's overreaction. The elderly woman, now emboldened by Ray's presence, stepped forward. "He's telling the truth," she said. "He helped me." Those boys ran off the second he shouted at them. Ben swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, looking down. Ray wasn't letting him off easy. Pointing a weapon at someone for no reason isn't just a mistake. It's a violation of trust. At that moment, other police units began arriving, the officers pulling up in their cars. Sergeant Carla Diaz, a no-nonsense veteran cop, emerged from one of the cruisers and strode toward them. "Cole, what's going on here?" she asked, her eyes quickly assessing the situation. Ray calmly explained everything while Sergeant Diaz listened intently. She turned to Ben, her expression growing darker. "Cole, is this true?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Ben nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Sergeant Diaz didn't waste time. Within minutes, Ben was escorted to a waiting vehicle, his badge and gun taken from him. Ray watched the officer being led away, but his attention quickly returned to the woman he'd helped. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, a small but grateful smile on her face. "Thank you, not just for helping me but for standing your ground. I'm sure that young officer would have hurt you if you didn't show that badge." Ray smiled, giving a nod of reassurance. It's important to remember that justice isn't always about laws and courts. Sometimes, it's about doing the right thing when it matters. As he resumed his walk through the now quiet streets of Maplebrook, Ray noticed something different. There was a new respect in the eyes of the people who had witnessed the entire event. Sometimes, standing up for what's right was all it took to make a difference. As Ray continued his walk through the quiet streets of Maplebrook, a sense of calm settled over him. He had done the right thing, standing up when it mattered, even when a young officer made dangerous assumptions. In a world that often felt governed by rules and procedures, Ray was reminded that sometimes true justice comes from the courage to act with integrity, even when no one is watching. The small crowd that had gathered earlier now dispersed, but their murmurs lingered. Whispers of the former government official who had prevented a robbery and confronted an officer's mistakes echoed throughout the town. For Ray, it wasn't about the attention or recognition, it was about the responsibility he felt to stand up for what was right, no matter his age. As he rounded the corner and entered his neighborhood, Ray smiled to himself. It wasn't about the medals or titles he'd once held, but about doing his part in a world that still needed people willing to make a stand. In that moment, he felt proud. Proud not just of what he had done, but of the reminder that it's never too late to do the right thing. In the end, that was the true mark of a life well lived.